You want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
You can't handle the truth!
Well, we're giving you the Michigan Sports Truth, the show that reveals facts, truth, research, and statistics and never messes around. We lay down the entire truth about everything regarding your Detroit and Michigan sports teams, no matter if it's good or bad. No junk, no entertainment, no homerism, no coddling, no pop culture, no opinions, no shilling, and no fluff. Head over to our website at MichiganSportsTruth.com, follow us on Twitter at Michigan_Truth, and like our Facebook page, The Michigan Sports Truth. The hosts of the Michigan Sports Truth podcast do not take any suggestions or criticism from any member of its audience on how it should be run. It is up to the host to decide what they want to cover. They also do not intend to be any amount of popular in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Additionally, the views of the audience, right or wrong, do not reflect the actual truth revealed on this program.
Episode 314 of the Week in Review edition is now in session. Taylor Phillips along with Buck Geno. Follow me on Twitter at DT2Phillips. Follow Buck Geno on Twitter at BuckGeno_. Not underscore, but Buck Geno, triple I, 3 I's for Roman numerals. Buck Geno the third. So just all the 4 Detroit professional sports teams to cover: the Lions, Red Wings, Pistons, and Tigers. Let's start with the Lions here.
Touchdown, Detroit Lions!
The Lions did some very early excellent work here, drafting center Frank Ragnow at number 20 from Arkansas. Because they needed a lot of they needed pure patented pass protection for Matthew Stafford and his running backs Amir Abdullah, LeGarrette Blount, Dwayne Washington, and Zach Zenner. They also picked up another running back to use in Kerryon Johnson from Auburn at number 43. He's a stud. And they had to trade up with the New England Patriots to get that guy. Then at number 82, they picked up Tracy Walker, a safety from Louisiana Lafayette. Deshaun Hand, a defensive end from Alabama at 114. And fullback Nick Bawden from San Diego State at number 237 in the 7th round. So they kicked off the NFL draft entirely with a bang, and then the rest just the last 2 draft picks weren't really as good. They weren't expected to be good anyway in any position.
Yeah, you look at who they picked and why they picked them. Overall, I thought it was a solid draft for them. They picked up Frank Ragnow in the first round, and I'll just kind of go chronologically. There was definitely a lot of people that thought they would be going with an offensive lineman in the first round, especially with the multitude of talent that was available in some other positions of need. But Frank Ragnow was on their radar, and the draft becomes a real poker game when you're talking about who you've picked when. Do you have to trade up to get to somebody that you might not be able to get later on? And who is it that is available at that time that you're going to be able to fill your greatest need with? And a lot of people thought that Harold Landry, having fallen all the way out of the first round, as it turned out, people really were thinking that Detroit would go with an edge rusher such as Harold Landry, being one of the positions that is most important now in today's game of football, especially on the defensive side. And Matt Patricia coming in as the head coach of the Lions, a lot of people thought that would be the pick, but it was not to be. They did pick up Frank Ragnow, who is projected to start, whether that be at center or whether that be at a guard position. That remains to be seen. But the biggest thing for the Detroit Lions was they have completely and unequivocally overhauled their entire offensive line since Bob Quinn was hired as the general manager. And Frank Ragnow was the last piece of that puzzle. Had some very good stats in the SEC for Arkansas as a center. Did not allow a sack in his college career. as a center, that becomes a little bit of a misleading stat because you don't necessarily think of a center as a great pass protector by himself. But be that as it may, I think it was a solid pick for them. They needed an interior offensive lineman who they can count on, whether they shuffle him around or they keep him at his natural position of center remains to be seen. But the Lions definitely had a theme in this draft, and we'll go into that a little bit more in depth as the picks go on. But Frank Ragnow, I believe, was a solid pick for them, and it obviously fit a need that the Lions felt they needed to address, which is not only pass protection, but also the running game. Obviously, a team that was ranked dead last in the National Football League in yards per attempt, something has to change. And the first thing you try to do is make it easier for the running backs you have on staff to be able to navigate the defense. And that's what they did by picking Frank Ragnow. Also, Matt Stafford got hit for the most times in his career last year. And for a quarterback that's not getting any younger and has suffered some minor injuries in the last couple of years because of the pressure that's gotten to him, they felt that this was a paramount need to go ahead and fill. So I'm not going to go completely off the board as some people did with Frank Ragnow being picked. They obviously, the people that are condemning the pick feel that the Lions could have been helped other positions in a more immediate need, but I think it was a great pickup simply because it pretty much spells the tone of what the rest of the draft and really what they want this team to look like. So I think that was a great pick for them. As you mentioned, in the second round, Lions traded up to get Kerryon Johnson from Auburn. And like I talked about the poker game, Frank Ragnow and Kerryon Johnson, both people are saying that they were going to be picked not just a few picks later, but maybe the next pick as it pertains to Ragnow. And certainly with Kerryon Johnson, a lot of teams had him on their radar. So the Lions felt they had to make a deal, and they were able to make that trade and move up in the second round to be able to snag Kerryon Johnson. I think Kerryon Johnson becomes probably their most talented back right now in the lineup without even having played a game simply because of the attributes that he has. I think he was a top 5 to top 7 running back in that class. And when you're getting somebody like that in the second round, you have to feel good about it. Now, the trade that they made, obviously, when you have picks, those are valuable. And the Lions did have to give up a pick in order to be able to move up. That said, I think that they needed to attack that position, especially because the team that they have, the running backs they have on the team right now, they went out and signed LeGarrette Blount. He mentioned Amir Abdullah. Really, outside of those two guys, you don't have a lot of dynamic performers at the running back position. And they need somebody that can carry the rock inside the tackles. And that somebody is going to be Kerryon Johnson, is what they believe. So I also believe this was a good pick because they needed somebody to really fit in with the identity of their team. And they just didn't have that person on their roster when it came to running backs. So they had to reach a little bit and move up to get Kerryon Johnson. I hate to say reach because obviously there were teams that were looking at him in the same area that the Lions did pick him up, but they had to move up to do so, and they felt that if they hadn't moved up, they wouldn't have been able to get him, and may have not been able to go with running back in that second position. And if they didn't go with running back then, after the first couple of rounds, really it's a real crapshoot as far as running backs go when you're drafting rookies in that position. So I think it was a good move. You never really like to give up picks, but I think that the trade-off was pretty minimal to be able to pick up one of the better running backs in the class. And as we move down, you said that the third-round pick was Tracy Walker, a safety from Louisiana Lafayette. I think this was probably the most polarizing pick because it looked really good for the Lions because they were excited to get him. I mean, Matt Patricia and Bob Quinn were fist-bumping, high-five, hugging, whatever you want to call it, after they were able to get Tracy Walker. But when you look at him, he is not a ready-to-start player. He is more of a developmental guy. And when you look at the theme of the later round picks, is versatility. Because when you're picking a guy probably fourth round or below, maybe even into the third round a little bit, you're looking to somebody that can be moved around. And Matt Patricia, obviously a defensive-minded coach, wants to set guys that can move around and occupy multiple positions in his defense. And Tracy Walker can be one of those guys. He's a little bit of a gambler. He had 8 interceptions in his career at Louisiana Lafayette. So he's got some ball skills, but obviously as a safety in the National Football League, you have to temper that because there's a lot of guys that can get behind the defense, and you have to be aware of that. So as a safety, they think that they can train him, they can groom him to perhaps replace Glover Quinn when that time becomes necessary, but also use him a little bit on special teams and also in some multiple defensive back sets. So when you talk about reaching, I think this was probably their biggest reach or their biggest gamble, so to speak, because there were probably some other safeties on the board that rated higher than him, and probably some other guys that at that position they may have been able to go with instead of Walker. But when you talk about Bob Quinn and Matt Patricia being really excited about this pick, they obviously had him on their radar for a long time, and that is why they made the selection. I think this is probably their weakest pick of the draft when you talk about talent in regards to value. But at the same time, it's that poker game. Do you think he's going to be around in the 4th or 5th round? Do you think that other teams don't have that same scouting report on him? And sometimes you don't want to take that chance, and other times you will. Well, Tracy Walker, obviously, they didn't want to take a chance on him being around later on because they didn't have all of their picks from last year. So they felt that they had to move around, and they had to get him now. And with the pick that they had traded earlier, they felt that they needed to move on Tracy Walker. So this one's probably a little bit lower grade as far as what they got in return, value-wise, picking him in the 3rd round, but they felt they needed him, and that's what they did. So they went out and got him. When you move down to the 4th round, Deshaun Hand from Alabama. This is a guy that a lot of mixed reviews were out for him. He was a defensive tackle at Alabama most frequently, but he can move around. And again, you talk about that versatility. He's a guy that can go all the way inside to the 3 technique defensive tackle. He can move outside to the 5 technique and be more of a hybrid pass rusher / run stopper from the inside. He can also move outside and give them a decent pass rush on the 7 or 9 technique. So a defensive end that they might be able to pair with Ziggy Ansah on the other side and move some guys around. And again, back to that versatility thing. Matt Patricia doesn't want a guy that can only play one position or is hamstrung by his skill set just being able to fit a certain spot. He wants guys that can move around, confuse the offense, and make the game planning harder for those opposing coaches because you don't know exactly where they're going to line up and what they're going to do. So Matt Patricia, obviously his stamp is going on this draft very early in his career, and Bob Quinn took with his blessing Deshaun Hand from Alabama. You talk about a guy, another SEC guy. It felt like the Lions after the first 2 rounds were just going to draft SEC guys, and they got 3 in the first 4 rounds. And you talk about versatility with Hand. Obviously, he slipped down to the 4th round simply because he didn't have a dominant skill set at one of those positions, either defensive tackle or defensive end. And that was probably why he slipped down to where he was at. But again, Detroit had to move up, so they did that, and they wanted to get that guy in the 4th round that could be a versatile defensive lineman. I think that he'll probably be in the opening rotation. I don't think he'll be a starter, but he'll probably see a lot of snaps. And again, with Matt Patricia wanting guys that can play multiple positions or fill multiple roles in that defense, Deshaun Hand is somebody that can do that. You move down to the 5th round. They went off the board a little bit, I think, in terms of what their strategy was. They selected Terrell Cosby from Oregon, as their 5th-round pick. Now, he was an offensive tackle in college, but I really don't see him playing tackle in the pros. He just doesn't have the feet for it. They'll probably slide him inside, and he'll probably become a 6th offensive lineman to fill gaps in when guys get hurt or guys need a rest. I don't think they'll see any time or very limited time at tackle. And again, I think that they'll probably flip him inside, and he's a really good run blocker. So again, back to that theme of being more of a straight-ahead physical game or physical team, ball control with a very opportunistic and flexible defense. And so the Lions go ahead and move on Tyrell Cosby, making him their 5th-round pick. He's got a lot of good things going for him as far as the value. A lot of people had him going much higher. But in the draft, and I talked about this last week, sometimes positions start to go. Sometimes they have a run on certain positions, and you have to sneak up to get a guy that might not be there later on, and you end up taking somebody that you didn't have on your board that early. And I think that's what happened to Tyrell Cosby is there was some runs on some other positions that shifted some guys back, and that's where Crosby became available in the 5th round. When you talk about what he looks like as a prospect, he didn't line up in a lot of pass sets. When you talk about true pass sets, they're talking about straight up passing down in distances, shotgun, or you're talking about under the center on 3rd and long, and knowing that they have to pass. I mean, Oregon is not a traditional offense in that manner, but when you talk about his ability to run block, that kind of trumps the fact that he's not a great pass blocker. So that's why I think they'll slip him inside to a guard spot and use his bulk and his strength and his very good run blocking ability. And I just don't think he'll be a starter, but I think that they can use him as a rotation guy or a guy that can pick up if somebody gets hurt. But again, this is a depth pick, and when you're talking about getting guys in the 5th, 6th, 7th round, you're not drafting starters anymore. You're trying to fill in gaps where you think that you may want to be able to fill in those as the season goes on. Didn't have a 6th round pick, so they had to go to the 7th round, and they picked up a fullback, Nick Bowden, from San Diego State. A lot of people looked at Rashad Penny and his success that he had, and they ended up getting Nick Bowden, who was the lead blocker for Rashad Penny. And they needed something in the run game. They needed a guy that could come out of the backfield and be a lead blocker, and that's who they went out and got. So he's a role-playing guy. He'll be a special teams guy. He'll be in on the heavy sets when they need a fullback to be the lead blocker. So it's quite apparent that the Lions, even though defense looked to be their greater needs overall, they drafted heavily on the offensive side, and they looked for big, physical, run blocking or running guys that can go between the tackles. And that's what the shift is right now for the Lions, because maybe Bob Quinn thinks that they're too finesse. Maybe he just thinks that they don't do it enough because they don't have the ability. Whatever the case may be, with all the draft picks that they made, I think that it's clear that not only are they looking for guys who are versatile, but they're looking especially to build up that running game, which was dead last in the league last year. And they really want to improve upon that. And when you have a guy who's on the defensive side of the ball become your head coach, that typically can be the game plan, because there's no better defense than a good ball control offense. They can't score typically when you're running the ball down their throat. So I think that the Lions had a clear strategy in this draft, and they executed it. So it's hard for me to grade these guys individually. We'll get to that later, but when you talk about grading guys, I mean, they haven't played a down of NFL football, so it's really hard to say, well, that was a great pick, or this guy's going to be good, or whatever. But I think that the Lions stuck to their strategy. I think that overall, except for the Stacey Walker pick, I think that they held on to becoming more physical and getting more bulky up front and getting a better presence. And when you look at overall, that was their main theme, is getting better on offense and becoming more of a dominant force in the run game. So I think that they did pretty well. And I think that they didn't go off the board too far in most cases. And again, we don't know exactly what the roster composition is going to be, but they got guys that they think they can use, just like every other team does in the NFL draft. But I think the Lions had a strategy. They stuck to it. They made some moves to make sure they got the guys they wanted. And I think overall for them, it was a successful draft.
Keep in mind, Deshaun Hannon was arrested last year in July for a DUI when the police found him asleep at the wheel of a parked but running car. While the arrest may have, that hurt his draft stock by some, and that's why he had some limited playing time with the Alabama Crimson Tide in their national championship winning season, their previous one last year. And that's why.
I mean, those are things that are going to come up. And I'm sure that made his draft stock drop a little bit. When he run into trouble with the law, that always puts teams a little bit on edge. But at the same time, if you get a guy that you think that you can work those problems out, or you think that he's past that, I think that that's something that they look at as well. And they firmly believe that Deshaun Hand is a guy that has probably learned his lesson, and that shouldn't be a problem. It's always something to bear in mind, but even though his draft stock dropped, sometimes that can work in the team's benefit as well, because you're getting a guy that maybe has better talent than where he's picked. But because of the off-field issues, he's down a little bit because teams are scared off by that, and the Lions feel that he's somebody that they can still utilize as a versatile defensive lineman, and they think that they can get past those issues that he had off the field.
Mm-hmm. So, got a couple of questions in our 5-question segment later on about the Lions and who they picked and what they could have done better. So, transitioning to the Red Wings here. Yep. The Red Wings end up with the 6th overall pick in the 2008 NHL Draft Lottery. They had the 5th going into the lottery. They dropped to number 6. Last year, they had 7th. They dropped to 9th because they didn't tank enough. They tanked a little bit more this year, and they got not as bad karma, but still plenty of bad karma to be left on the table. We found some tweets from Jeff Moss about the draft lottery, and he tweeted, "My sources inside the Red Wings front office tell me they are looking to take a power play specialist or defenseman who looks like he is 11 years old with a 6th overall pick." Then he quoted his own tweet and said, "My apologies, bad intel. Those were the last 2 first-round picks." He also tweeted, "Not getting Dahlin ensures the Wings will still be horrible in 2 years when Holland's contract ends. Chris, I will say, quote, I like our prospects and how things are coming. Wouldn't want to fly a plane with a pilot who hasn't done it before," unquote, while Vegas lifts the cup for a 3rd straight season. And then he tweeted, "Not only do the Wings not get Dahlin and slip a spot, there's a 66% chance that he's going to end up in their division. Good luck with all that, Ken Holland and Chris Ilitch, that is." Anthony Ciotti replied, "The Wings should offer the older Svechnikov, Evgeny Svechnikov, that is, to whoever gets Andre. He will never have a higher value." And then Harpo at Dan Double C replied, "Evan Bouchard should be available at 6.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the guys that are going to get picked. The overall consensus first pick is going to be Rasmus Dahlin. Andrei Svechnikov is the top-ranked North American skater. And, you look at his older brother, Evgeny, who's in the Red Wings system right now.
There are 2 Svechnikovs, yep.
Yep, and you've also got Brady Tkachuk, the younger brother and of Matthew Tkachuk and the son of Keith Tkachuk, and also Philip Zadina. Some guys that are on the higher end of the draft boards probably going to be gone. So you're talking about the sixth pick. There's a lot of defensive prospects that are still going to be around. A lot of them, seems to be a bumper crop for defensemen in the 2018 draft. So if you're Detroit, boy, you've drafted a lot of forwards in the past. You don't have a lot of impact players on defense. This seems like a perfect draft if you're Detroit to go out and get one of those defensemen that are ranked in the top 10. As you mentioned, Evan Bouchard is one of them. He's a power play quarterback guy. He's got a pretty good shot. He's a right-handed shot. When you're talking about what they need, I'm not sure a power play quarterback is exactly what they need right now because they've got a lot of holes. You're probably looking for a guy who's got some more defensive prowess and some guys that can move the puck on a 5-on-5 situation. Quinn Hughes, one of those guys, a freshman at Michigan. A lot of people are projecting him to be available with that sixth pick. And again, you never know what those other 5 teams ahead of you are going to do. But the projection is that there should be a defenseman, whether it be Hughes or Bouchard or Noah Dobson or even Anna Boakvist. All 4 of those guys are defensive players that are ranked very high on the NHL draft board. And at least, if not all of those guys that I just mentioned, should be available with the Detroit Red Wings' 6th pick. So I think that Detroit has obviously been granted a little bit of a reprieve here because they need defense. They don't have a lot of organizational depth at that position when you're talking about impact prospects. And it seems tailor-made for them to be able to take somebody that is on the defensive side of the ledger and get them into the system as soon as possible and hopefully accelerate their development so that they can be an impact on the team in the next couple of years. Because if you're picking that high, you can't be picking a guy that you don't think is going to be around in the next couple of years. You have to pick a guy that literally is going to be available either in that year or the next. You'd prefer it to be somebody that's NHL ready, but looking at the guys that are going to be possibly available at that time, there's some guys that have some growing to do. They're relatively, when you talk about younger players, they're relatively small. But you would hope that they're able to get somebody that can move the puck and has a little bit of defensive grit to their game and is able to play a two-way game. And I would say that if it was going to be me, I would look for somebody that could make the first pass because that's something that they haven't had since Nick Lidstrom retired, is a guy that can make the long pass to start the breakout. And when you're talking about having a successful offensive team, that first pass is so important. So if they can pick a guy like a Quinn Hughes or a Noah Dobson, I think those are probably the guys that they should target simply because even though they're on the smaller end of the size scale, Noah Dobson is 6'3", but he's only 180 pounds. Quinn Hughes goes 5'10", 170. I think either one of those guys would be a great pick because they're both lauded for their breakout skills. They have a great first pass. They can move the puck. And Detroit really doesn't have a lot of guys in the system that can do that right now. They barely have any guys that can do that right now, in fact. So I would say that if you're Detroit, you're looking to get one of those guys. And Noah Dobson and Quinn Hughes, at least one of those two guys should be ready to go when you make that sixth pick. And that's what I would predict that they were going to go with.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that explains it. So, transitioning to the Pistons.
Left sideline, 3, and he answers.
Still no word on Stan Van Gundy's future as the head coach and team president of basketball operations. Tom Gores and Stan Van Gundy said 2 weeks ago that last week they were going to resume talks, and we haven't got any word out of them yet. Are they continuing talks again sometime later this week or any time in the future this summer? I mean, this has now become a bigger mystery.
I think when there's no news, that tends to lead people to make speculation and start to think of the scenarios that could be happening. In most cases, that's probably just what it is. There is no news, and I don't think that there's going to be any moves made right now in that regard, because I've mentioned it a couple of times, and I'll keep going to it. If you don't have a suitable replacement, there's no reason to move on. Now, Stan Van Gundy as a coach has had his foibles and has been widely panned for some of the things that he's done as the Pistons coach, and also as a team president, helping out with the draft. And their draft record has not been exemplary when he's come on board. They're probably not going to have a first-round pick this year, barring a miracle. So you have to look at the overall picture and say, well, he hasn't done that well with the drafts. Their coaching, the coaching that he's provided has been a little bit less than what has been expected or has at least been hoped for. And at the same time, there's not going to be NBA coaches that are making moves that are going to be much better. Now, Mike Budenholzer left the Atlanta Hawks. They split ways amicably or at least mutually, but that doesn't mean that he's going to be the next Pistons coach, because he's obviously already got another job lined up. Some reports I have him moving on already. So when you're talking about movement and guys are going to be available, there's not a lot of guys out there right now that are suitable replacements that are head and shoulders above what Stan Van Gundy's been able to do for the Pistons. Now, again, that doesn't mean that Stan Van Gundy's done a great job, in my estimation. It just means that there's not anybody else around that they feel that they can go ahead and make a move on. Number two, he's got another year on his contract. So even if you decide to part ways with him, you're going to have to pay him for that year or buy him out. So you're going to be paying two guys to do one job. And right now they're paying one guy to do two jobs. And value-wise, obviously, that's a good thing for Tom Gores and the Pistons, because you don't have to pay two separate salaries. You're paying Stan Van Gundy a combined salary to be your team president and your head coach. So, that's another factor, because if you bring another coach on, he certainly isn't going to be filling the role of team president. You're going to have to find somebody else to do that. And there's not a lot of talk going around as far as who could fill that role. Now, there was a rumor a couple of months back that Chauncey Billups might be interested in that, and that was quickly struck down, mostly by Billups, because he didn't want to appear to be making any arrangements or trying to get somebody fired so that he could get a job. So he quickly moved that down and dismissed that speculation. But the fact remains is, if they're thinking about it, that's probably somebody that they've contacted or would contact about that position. So there's a lot of moving pieces and parts here, but with the length of time that has gone without any real news about the situation, my feeling is that there's probably not going to be any movement, simply because you don't wait that long just to make a move. I don't think that they would wait this long to see how everything pans out with the rest of the movement and coaches and front office personnel, to then be late in the game, especially as close as they are to the draft, and then completely change over not only the team president but their head coach. So even though Stan Van Gundy has underperformed in his job, especially on the draft end, they're not going to have a first-round pick in all likelihood. So he's not going to have a chance to do anything there. And as far as players and everything else, they have a lot of contracts that are pretty well set in stone. So this team is what it is. And it's going to be Stan Van Gundy's job to make them better than they were last year. Obviously, Reggie Jackson's injury hurt them more than a lot of people want to admit. But at the same time, you can't just blame injuries on some of the underperforming players and some of the player personnel decisions as far as the everyday rotation or playing time for those guys that are on the roster. So with all these things that are being thrown about, I just think that the Pistons are really waiting around, and maybe they're trying to chum the waters a little bit and see if anybody will pipe up and see if they're interested. But I just don't think that this is going to be something that really pans out into a whole lot, other than This is probably the last step for Stan Van Gundy, because if they don't get any better, they don't have any significant improvement, then they're probably going to be looking for another guy next year at this time.
Right. Stan Van Gundy is probably going to stay for his last year in his contract anyway. So, only one team left to cover, and that's the Tigers.
That one is long gone.
They lose 2 of 3 each at the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Baltimore Orioles. My God, that's pathetic. Well, the Pittsburgh Pirates actually now lead the NL Central with a 17-11 record. They've improved a little bit, but the Baltimore Orioles still last place in the AL East.
Yeah.
My God, second worst in the American League. Third worst in the majors. And the Tigers lose 2 of 3 to them. My God, they sweat them at home at Comerica Park, but then that happens. Hey, the suckitude is starting to ooze out of this mediocrity machine. It's starting to cover some of it, like the Blob back in the 1960s.
Well, you look at the week, and baseball is a week by week thing. It's a day by day thing. There's 162 of those suckers, and sometimes you have stretches like this. But I would say probably the one thing that let them down is the thing that's let them down so far this season. It's been inconsistent bats. They win a 13-10 game on Wednesday. Then they lose the back end of a doubleheader because the game from Tuesday got moved to the Wednesday double dip because of weather, and then they lose the nightcap 8-3. So they gave up 18 runs in 2 games and somehow managed to win one of them. And then Thursday, after they score themselves 16 runs in 2 games, they get shut out on Thursday. And Michael Fulmer pitches a great game and ends up losing 1-0. He got the Justin Verlander disease, where he can't get any run support and pitches a heck of a game, and the bullpen ends up blowing it. So, kind of a hard series to read, because obviously with the doubleheader that changed some things with the weather postponing Tuesday's game. But again, you look at the inconsistency, and that's going to be the theme for the Tigers this year. They're going to be consistently inconsistent. And then they follow up that shutout loss against the Pirates. They go to Baltimore and they get shut out by Chris Tillman, who's no good. And they lose to the Orioles. Then they go on yesterday and they score 9, and they win 9-5. And then today, probably really their only conventional game, if you want to look at it all week, they lose today at 5-3, and started out right off the gate down 3-0 after 2. Daniel North struggled, and now it's being reported that he might have another injury that he's trying to battle through, and just a guy that cannot get off that injury list. So they have to go to the bullpen and really start to work those guys in. Alex Wilson comes in, throws 2 2/3 innings of scoreless ball, which is a pretty big improvement for him because he has sucked pretty much this entire season. And then they bring in Buck Farmer for an inning, who has a rough outing, gives up 2 hits and a run, but also strikes out the side. I mean, if that's not the model of inconsistency, I don't know what is. So, they're able to somehow navigate the waters, keep the game close, and then Joe Jimenez comes in on the last part and gives up 1 run in the 8th to really seal their fate. And then the Baltimore Orioles are able to close them out. But, I mean, the Orioles are just not a good ball club. And you thought with Chris Tillman going to the Hill on Thursday, and he had pitched poorly this season to date, and he had not been very good really over the last, I would say probably the last third of last season, if not more. He's just not very good, and he goes and shuts out the Tigers. That's what you're going to be looking at this year with the Tigers, is when you think they're going to zig, they'll zag. When you think they're up, they'll be down. This is just how it's going to be. And when you're talking about a younger team that is not projected to do a whole lot, this is a big reason why, because you don't have guys that have a real set profile of how they're going to perform. And it's just going to be that way for the entire season. And so if you think that you're going to jump into this Tiger season and see some spectacular turnaround, or they're going to start to put it together, I just don't think that's going to happen. but at the same time, you shouldn't be expecting a whole lot. And 11-15 is where they sit now record-wise. And, boy, I don't think that I thought they would have that many wins by this point. So, put it all together, you look at the Tigers, and that's what it's going to boil down to, is which team shows up when. Does the pitching collapse, or does the hitting vanish? You really just never know with this team. And I think that the one thing, if you're a Tigers fan, is to hope that they don't get too hot and win a bunch of games in a row when it really doesn't mean a whole lot, and end up getting a higher pick in the draft. They do have the number 1 pick coming up in this summer's draft, so we've got that to look forward to. Looks like more and more it's going to be Mize from Auburn. Really, a lot of people are putting a lot of stock on him being the pick for the Tigers. He's having a pretty good season so far for Auburn, and that's really what you have to look forward to, because this year is going to be a pretty rudderless year, and so far they haven't disappointed in that regard.
Right. So the Tigers return home to take on the Tampa Bay Rays Monday through Wednesday, and then they're in Kansas City with the Royals, the worst team in the AL, Thursday at 2:15, Friday at 8:15, Saturday at 4:15, and Sunday at 2:15. 4-game series. It's on the road. The Tigers have had their troubles on the road, especially with the Pirates and the Orioles. Let's see what happens in Kauffman Stadium next week.
Yeah, I mean, the Royals are just bad, just very bad.
Terrible.
And you would hope that you would think that the Tigers could, on paper, be better than them. But again, as we were shown earlier when they matched up with the Royals, the Royals came away victorious with 2 wins, and that's just going to be the Tigers. Like I said, when you think that they're going to be up, they'll be down. And they ran into Baltimore. Baltimore was the 3rd worst team in MLB, and they ended up getting 2 out of 3 from the Tigers. It's just really hard to predict this team, and I'm not going to try to do that, because anytime that I make one of those predictions, it's probably going to go the other way. So you just kind of have to grin and bear it. I think that the Tigers' end game is going to be get the young kids as many playing time and at-bats as they can possibly get, and that's probably what's going to happen. You just look for some guys to have steady improvement, and hopefully that you can set yourself up to start to build back up.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So that's all the teams we covered. So
it's time for 5 questions on the Michigan Sports Truth.
Question number 1: will the Lions eventually cut their 2 bottom draft picks? I wouldn't think so. I don't even know which bottom draft pick they would cut, or if any.
Yeah, it's a good question. I really like that one. I think if there's going to be anybody, it's probably going to be Crosby, simply because he's a depth offensive lineman, and you can find those guys in a lot of places. And if they can find somebody with some experience, they might be tempted to move on from him. And nothing lost, nothing gained there when you're cutting a 5th or 6th or 7th round pick. But at the same time, you're trying to get younger, and the NFL is a young man's game. And if you can find somebody better than him, you're not going to probably find anybody cheaper than him. So I think that I don't foresee them cutting either of the 2. I think that Nick Bowden is probably less likely to get cut than Crosby, actually, simply because of the position he plays and the role that they envision for him. But I think they really I think they both are going to be able to navigate their way onto the 53-man roster, barring any injury.
Yeah, I forgot about Tyrell Crosby. I didn't even mention him. Oh, there he is, a tackle guard from Oregon. The Bleacher Report grades him an A. Crosby's a thick, strong run blocker with a spirited finish. He has enough quickness to be an adequate pass protector. He's built like a guard and lacks the traits and technique of an elite pass protector. Terrifying. There's nothing worse than drafting the left tackle you would probably know what to move to guard than moving him to guard and realizing you would have just been better off drafting a true guard. It's basically the Seahawks paradox. Bottom line, Crosby should grow into a capable blocker at some position on the offensive line. That position is also almost certainly not left tackle, but he's an excellent value in this spot. So they grade him an A.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, he's going to be a rotational type of player. I don't see him as a starter right now. Obviously, injuries can change that very quickly, but I just don't see them putting him in the starting spot right now. But that's what training camp is for, and that's what OTAs are for. That's what all these things are for, is to find out what you have, and rookie camp and all these other things that happen before the season starts. That's when you start to really find out what you can do with these guys. So I don't know if they're going to cut those two, but like I said, if there's going to be one, I would think it would be Crosby, simply because they may just not have enough offensive line spots open for him. But there's a reason they drafted him, and they want those big, beefy run blockers. And so my initial answer still stands. I just think they still navigate their way onto the 53-man.
I would say during the preseason and training camp, give him enough time at least to develop, and then see what happens.
Absolutely. I mean, they know who their starters are going to be at this point. So it's just going to be the question of where. And you really want to see in the preseason and even in camp and some of the joint practices and whatnot, see him in different spots against different guys and see what he can do. Because there's nothing worse than drafting a guy and then not getting him the time to develop and then ending up cutting him. And then some other team picks him up and he turns into a good player. So you're right. Let him have some snaps at left guard and see if he can't make it a go there. I just don't think he's an NFL tackle. I don't think he projects out to be that way. But if you want a guy that can be a decent run blocker, maybe, like I said, he's that sixth offensive lineman. Maybe you put him in some heavy sets, and when it's time to run block, he gets out there.
Yeah.
Next question.
Question number 2, what could the Lions have done better overall in the entire NFL draft?
Not a whole lot. I think that they had a solid draft. Really, like I said, the biggest reach or the biggest off-the-board pick that they made was Walker, the safety. And I think a lot of people believe that same thing just by looking at the grades. A lot of people had that graded as a C or below move. And the only reason they graded it that is not because they don't think Walker can develop into something, but because there were so many other players that the Lions could have taken at that point that would have had some more talent and also been able to be a little bit more plug and play. I think the third round isn't the time to get a developmental guy unless you really think that he's got something on tape that you can see that just hasn't been able to go all the way to fruition yet. And I really believe the way that Patricia and Quinn acted when they were able to get Walker really speaks volumes of how they think of that pick, because there weren't a lot of people that loved that pick, but boy, those two guys in the room did. And that's really the most important part. They think they see something in him, and they really wanted to get him, so they went ahead and got him before anybody else could. And it goes back to that poker game analogy. They didn't think that he would last as long as they could hold on to the fourth round. And so they went ahead and grabbed him in the third round. So I would say if they could have done anything better, it may have been get a better value pick at that draft position. They didn't address edge rusher at all, which makes me think that they either A, believe that they're already set at that position, even though clearly by last year's performance they're not. Or B, they think that they can scheme around that enough with the personnel that they have and the guys that they added into Sean Hand. They think that they can fix some things on there that aren't going to be personnel driven, but rather scheme driven. So it remains to be seen. But Matt Patricia, obviously a very heralded defensive coordinator, feels that he can do what he needs to do with the personnel that they have right now at those positions. So that's why they went with Walker as a safety. And I think they should have gone edge rusher, but I'm not an NFL GM. I don't know all the things that they know. So if it was me, that would be the only thing I thought they could have done better, which was get somebody a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more plug-and-play NFL ready than Walker. But on the flip side, I think that they also believe that they have the personnel to do what they want right now. And you never know who's going to get cut, who's going to get hurt. Those are variables that you just can never get a true hold on until they actually happen. So the Lions may think that there are some free agents or some guys that might get cut that they can use later on, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Next question.
Question number 3, can the Lions get any available free agents later on this summer?
Well, can they or will they? That's the real question. Can they? Obviously they can. Cap-wise, they do have a little bit of room. Now, signing the onset to that franchise tag, that's going to hamstring them a little bit. But at the same time, there's going to be guys that are available. And when it comes cut day, you never know who's going to be standing there without a job. So, free agent-wise, I don't know how aggressive they're going to be now because that period is pretty much over with. But again, you can always find guys that need a job, and there's always players to be had. And I think that the Lions can certainly make that move. But as I mentioned before, they probably believe that they have the personnel that are ready to go and are ready to go ahead and move forward. So will they? I don't know. Can they? Absolutely.
Next question.
Question number 4, transitioning a little bit. Who could we expect the Red Wings to select with their 6th overall selection in the 2018 NHL Draft?
Well, earlier in this segment, when we talked about the draft lottery, I put 2 names out there, Noah Dobson and Quinn Hughes, and I think that either one of those guys would be a great pick. They're both projected to have excellent puck-moving skills. They can skate, and I think Dobson right now probably has the edge just because he's a little bit bigger and still has some of those same attributes as opposed to Quinn Hughes, who's a little bit smaller. But the game is moving towards a little bit smaller defensemen who are a little bit quicker and looking towards guys who can move the puck and bring some speed to the game. And the Red Wings, for the longest time, they tended to go against conventional wisdom, and they continue to do so. But I think that if you're looking at who they can expect to pick, I would tab one of those 2 guys because I can't imagine both of them will be off the board by pick 6, and they definitely need somebody that can move the puck on that back end because they just lack so much on the defensive end right now. There's a lot of things that they lack, but I would say the glaring hole right now is being able to move the puck out of their own end, and they just don't have that guy that can make those headman passes and get the forwards out in open space. And so I would say that I would expect them to pick either Dobson or Hughes.
Next question.
Question number 5. When will the talk between Tom Gores and Stan Van Gundy ever end in the Pistons front office? I know Stan Van Gundy's probably got to come back at some time point, but they still got a whole summer to make up their minds. But to me already, I feel like they're just taking a little bit too long.
It may not end until September when camps open and it's time for preseason. I mean, that could be the case. I eventually think this will calm down. I also think that when you're talking about guys who get paid to write about this team and get paid to pontificate upon what they're doing, there's not a whole lot going on. They're not in the playoffs. Free agency hasn't started yet, obviously. The draft is a pretty much foregone conclusion because they probably won't have a draft pick in the first round. And so there's really not a whole lot to be talking about. So I think that this is a product of more people just trying to find information where there might not be any. So this will probably drag on until somebody comes out and says that they're not going to make any changes, whether that be tomorrow or whether that be in July. I don't know. But I just think that with the Pistons in the state that they're in, there's not so much to talk about other than this. And so that's why we're getting a healthy dose of what's going to happen with Stan Van Gundy. Because literally, that is probably the only thing that you can talk about with this team.
Mm-hmm. So that wraps up our 5-question segment and to our entire audience. If you want to answer those 5 questions, just replay that segment portion of this episode and answer them the best you can without going out of line.
Pencils down, everyone. It's time to find out what's your grade.
And this is the NFL Draft edition of What's Your Grade? 6 players to grade. We'll start with Frank Ragnow, the center from Arkansas, at 20. I give him an A-.
Yeah, I'm going to go with that same grade. A lot of the grades that I've seen have been anywhere between A- and B-. It's a big position of need. They needed another interior lineman, and they got probably the best one that they could at that position, or at that value, which is the 20th pick in the first round. So I'm going to go with an A-, because even if he doesn't start at center, they project him to start at one of the 2 guard positions. And they need a big guy who can run block and also has some ability in the pass game to be able to protect Matthew Stafford. So I think that they made a really good pick in this first round with Frank Ragnow, so I'm going to go with an A-.
Yep. Then you got running back Kerryon Johnson from Auburn at number 43 in a trade with the New England Patriots. Bleacher Report grades him in a mid-range A, and so do I.
Well, there's 2 things that you have to consider when you talk about this pick. The pick itself, I think it's a great pick. The fact that they had to trade up to get him and lose an asset to be able to get to him, that's kind of a downer, because those picks are highly valued. But I think that because they felt they needed to have Kerryon Johnson, because that was the only reason they traded up. I mean, they weren't trading up and they got surprised that he was there. I mean, it was a pretty obvious, hey, we're going to pick this guy if we can get into this spot. So they moved up to get him. I'm going to give this a B+, because I think that overall he's a great pick. But the fact that they had to move up to get him and sacrifice an asset, no matter how small it was, in the pick that they traded to New England, that kind of dampens it a little bit, simply because I think that they may have been able to fill another spot with that other additional pick. They weren't able to do that now that they've traded that to New England, and they got the guy they wanted. But again, when you look at the later rounds that they picked, the picks that we'll go over here in the later rounds, it would have been maybe nice to have that position that they gave up to get Kerryon Johnson.
Then you got safety Tracy Walker from Louisiana Lafayette at number 82. I'll let you go first this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is probably I don't want to say worst pick, but I think this is probably their weakest pick, simply because of where they got him. And we've talked about it ad nauseum in this episode, where this is the guy that Quinn and Patricia wanted. Whether or not people think it's the sexy pick or the right pick is really a moot point, because this is the guy that they really wanted. And you can tell that by the reaction they had when they were able to make the pick for Tracy Walker. So I think they probably would have gotten better return on investment with some guys at that same position that were drafted later, but they saw something in Tracy Walker. So I'm going to give this draft pick a C+, because I think there was better available players. But at the same time, when you want a guy, you go get him. And I think that we saw in this draft for the Detroit Lions, when they had somebody in their sights, they made sure they went out and got him.
Mm-hmm. Defensive end Deshaun Hand from Alabama at 114.
Well, the 4th round pick, and they had to move up a little bit here again as well to get him. And it's a little bit of a trend with the Detroit Lions in this draft. They're moving up to get guys, and they're picking guys that they really feel fit with their need. And Deshaun Hand, for all his off-field issues, he had, like you mentioned, that DUI arrest. They didn't seem to think that was a huge issue. They did probably drop him a little bit lower than what he eventually went. or what people thought he would eventually go. But he's a versatile guy. He can play inside. He can go outside. And in a Matt Patricia defense, you can't just play one position or you can't fill one role. You've got to be able to move around. And Deshaun Hand is a prototypical pick in the Matt Patricia era. I think you're going to see this in later round picks as the drafts progress with Matt Patricia. Guys that can move around, guys that are flexible, and Deshaun Hand is that guy. So I'm going to give this one a B+, simply because they were able to get somebody that they feel that they can put into virtually any defensive line position and be a serviceable or better player.
Mm-hmm. 2 to go. Next up is Tyrell Crosby, a tackle and a guard from Oregon at 153. Bleacher Report again grades it a mid-range A. What's your grade?
I'm not as high on this pick as a lot of other people. I think he's a really good player. I think he fits the need that Detroit is looking for or is looking to fill, which is a bruising run blocker. I just think that for as highly graded as Crosby was, there was a reason that he went all the way down to the 5th round. And the fact that he is not an active pass blocker and he comes from a non-traditional offensive set that Oregon ran, I think that's probably why I'm not as high on it, because I know that there's guys that have succeeded in the pros. Marcus Mariota is one of them, that have come from those college offenses that are so much in contrast to what the NFL does on a day-to-day basis. But the fact remains is that he's not really a prototypical NFL lineman when you talk about the fact that they're going to need him in pass pro. And he didn't really do that in Oregon. He was not that guy. And so when you're talking about a more traditional drop back passer or in the shotgun formation and being a pass down or a pass set, he doesn't have a lot of experience there. And yes, I know that they were looking for him to be a run blocker and they really want to add some depth there, and I get it. I just don't know if at this pick, they might have been able to go off the board a little bit more as far as fixing that edge rusher, because they neglected to really pick a true defensive end at any of their picks. And yes, I know we're talking about the 5th round, and you're not going to be able to get the next Pro Bowl player from there, most likely. But at the same time, I think that they have an offensive line that they really like, and I know they're trying to add some depth there. I just don't know if Crosby's that guy. I don't know if he's going to be that guy that they can count on to slip into a role, especially with his lack of pass pro ability, that they think that they're getting. So I'm going to grade this one a B+, because of the value that he did bring. Everybody seems to be really high on him, but there's a reason he got down to the 5th round, and I think that's because they looked at his relative inexperience in the pass game, and a lot of teams took a pass on him because of that.
Mm-hmm. I would have to agree there. And finally, fullback Nick Bawden from San Diego State, the Aztecs, at 237.
Well, this is a pretty specific pick. Nick Bawden is obviously there for his role as a fullback. There's not a lot of teams that run traditional I formation or split back with a fullback nowadays, but when they do need him, it's a nice tool to have. And I think that he probably can make enough of a living on special teams to justify his roster spot. But obviously, the trend for the Lions was to get better in the run game. And one way to get better in the run game is have an effective lead blocker. So Nick Bawden fits that role. And we could see at San Diego State, when he was blocking for Rashad Penny, who was one of the better rushers in the NCAA last year, there was some real method to that madness because he had a lead blocker such as Nick Bawden. So I don't necessarily dislike the pick. Obviously, when you're talking about a fullback, that's kind of being it's a little bit of a lost art because you don't see a lot of fullbacks in the NFL nowadays. You see more of an H-back or a tight end / fullback where they're not really a traditional fullback in the true sense. But that said, they're looking to make those 3rd down and 1 situations go away. They were obviously the worst team in yards per attempt, and it didn't get any better when it was 3rd and 4th down and short yardage. So they're really attacking that, and they think that that's the key to having this team succeed, is being able to convert those situations. And one of those guys that they think that can help them with that is Nick Bawden. So I'm going to give this one a B, just a flat B, because it definitely fits the role that they're looking for. At the same time, there's some other needs that didn't get addressed. And when you're talking about picking in the 7th round, it's kind of a grab bag. But, there's some guys that were on the defensive side that got picked later on or just before him that project out to be some nice players. And they went ahead and got a fullback. So I'll give it a B because they had a mission and they stuck to that game plan, which was getting better at the run game. And that was a clear theme in this year's draft for the Lions. So I think that they did what they wanted to here, and that counts for something. So that's why I'm giving it a B.
All right. So those are the Lions draft picks, and these are the grades for each of them. So that's our What's Your Grade segment. So for our audience, if they have a grade for each player in the NFL Draft Edition and the What's Your Grade segment, post them in the comment bank in this episode, and please don't go out of line. That's episode 314 of the Week in Review. Before we sign off, we want to remind everyone to share this episode and our entire podcast on social media and have their friends share that as well, because we want to tell them that the Michigan Sports Truth podcast is searching for a wider local audience that is fans of sports, especially our teams. So please spread the word about the Michigan Sports Truth podcast, its Facebook page, and its Twitter handle at Michigan_Truth. Buck, excellent job as always. We'll talk to you next week.
All right, very good.
Yep. So, I'm Taylor Phillips. Follow me on Twitter at DT2Phillips and Buck Geno on Twitter at BuckGeno3, 3 I's for Roman numerals. We'll talk to you next week on episode 315 of the Week in Review. Thanks very much for listening, downloading, and sharing. TTFN, ta-ta for now.
The hosts of the Michigan Sports Truth podcast do not take any suggestions or criticism from any member of its audience on how it should be run. It is up to the host to decide what they want to cover. They also do not intend to be any amount of popular in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Additionally, the views of the audience, right or wrong, do not reflect the actual truth revealed on this program.
Mission complete.